It's Friday, and that means another edition of the Zogby Report, real and unscripted. And I'm John Zogby, pollster, and I'm here with my son, Jeremy Zogby, pollster. How you doing today?
Good, you?
I'm okay. Yeah, you want to get right into it?
Yeah, and I don't even have an inkling of what you're going to talk about.
You do not, because I really didn't until a little while ago. So I thought today would be Polls Day.
Poll day.
Yeah, because that's what we do, isn't it?
Yeah.
All right. So I want to look at a bunch of them, some of which you'll be more familiar with than others. Just by way of an update, we talked about the Pennsylvania Senate race, which everybody really is rating as the key Senate race in the country today, because it's Pennsylvania, of course, was very close in 2020. It's an open seat, and really it's unpredictable at the moment. But there are a couple of developments recently that are important. There are 3 new polls out this week on the Republican side. There's a very hot primary there where David McCormick, who is a former Treasury official and a hedge fund manager, taking on Mehmet Oz, Dr. Oz. Oz had been the front runner, and everybody thought, mainly because of name recognition. 3 new polls out today show David McCormick pulling ahead of Dr. Oz, anywhere from 5 to 9 percentage points. Not only is he pulling ahead, Oz is slipping from 19-20% support to 11 to 15% support. Now, to give you some idea of how much the stakes are, let's just look at finances. McCormick has already spent $14 million on television. This is as of the first week of March. This is a primary that doesn't take place for several more weeks. Oz lent himself, his campaign, $5 million, is not catching on with the party, but now does not appear to be catching on with voters. Now, this is like watching a horse race, because there are a few other candidates, but one of those candidates is a woman named Carla Sands, who's a longtime Republican, Pennsylvanian, and former ambassador to the Netherlands. And Carla Sands is accusing both McCormick and Oz of being carpetbaggers. And so what we're watching right now, one poll has Oz pretty much in a tie for second place with Carla Sands. Other polls have her in a solid third place, but rising. So fascinating race going on there. Impressionistically, I don't know that you're necessarily following it all, but what do you think?
Well, the thing that jumped out to me was regarding the 3 polls, that there was anywhere from a 5 to 9% lead, and that McCormick, $14 million spent on television ads, whereas Oz only $5 million. So I think the signal is clear that to get that either tied or to get ahead, he's going to have to spend about 15 to 20 million.
Which is staggering.
It's unbelievable, but given that he's the MAGA candidate, and that's still a major force in the Republican Party, I don't think he'll have a hard time coming up with that money.
Yeah, they're actually both, to some degree, MAGA candidates, but I think if you were able to, if we placed a label on it, I think you would see that McCormick had a little bit more mainstream Republican to him. He's married to a former official in both the Bush administrations and Trump administration.
Well, if MAGA continues with, maybe they'll drain the swamp, but I don't think, an essential feature of MAGA is anti-establishment, and given that he was Wall Street hedge fund secretary, and then it all comes down to, is Trump going to back McCormick, or is Trump going to offer his support for Oz? And I think it's Oz. So I think Oz is the MAGA candidate.
Okay, yeah, I agree with that. There's action on the Democratic side, but I think we'll hold off on that until there's some new polling out. But the Pennsylvania race on the Democratic side will define the Democratic Party going forward in the state of Pennsylvania, because you have clearly a Sanders-like progressive, and then you have a real Pennsylvania moderate. You know, I used to call Pennsylvania the land of liberal Republicans and conservative Democrats, and Connor Lamb is kind of on the conservative Democratic side. The next one I want to look at is what, you know, Charlie Cook and the guys that rate Senate races are actually calling the number 10 of the top 10 races to watch. But there was a development just this past week, Missouri. Now, Missouri, I polled Missouri a lot over the years. I can't tell you the number of 1-point races for U.S. Senate and for governor. This is a former governor on the Republican side, Eric Greitens, who was forced to resign in the middle of his term, sexual misconduct and some misplaced campaign funds. He does not have the backing of the party in his run now for Senate, and the new poll shows him almost pulling away in the primary race. He's up to 31% support. His next highest challenger is about 22 or 23%. That in itself can make Missouri a very pivotal race, because if he wins the nomination, let's say the Republicans may have a bigger problem on their hands than they thought. So we're going to go through, as we've talked before, we're going to go through these races methodically, but because there were two developments with two new polls, I thought we'd touch on them. So now let's go to the only polls that count. And those are the polls by John Zogby Strategies, right?
That's right.
Okay, so we've got a New York poll out, and you know, a lot to do with the horse race, and the details are on our website. But what I wanted to talk about is our client, Unite New York, which is a reform movement aimed at electoral/political reforms. How do voters feel about the two-party system in New York? Are they well served? What about the long-standing rule where New York is only one of 9 states where you have to be registered in the party to be able to vote in the primary itself? Term limits, that sort of thing. What stood out? The details are on our website, but what stood out to you in terms of those reforms, where voters stood and what it all meant?
Well, the one that consistently had high levels of support, I mean overwhelming majority, is term limits.
Yes.
As of today, that stands, and by the way, we've tested 2 different sets of questions with these reforms. First, do you agree or disagree? And then, you know, that's the I guess you could say the baseline. But then take it a step further with an actionable question: are you more likely or less likely to support a candidate who supports X, Y, Z reform? And so, I mean, on the agree side, all of these reforms, whether it's ballot initiatives, holding ballot initiatives, whether it's term limits or open primaries, vast majorities of New York voters agree with them. Now, to the second set of questions, are they more likely to get you to vote for the candidate? Term limits has held out very high. 61% was the last one.
They'd be more likely to support the candidate.
If the candidate
ran on
who ran on term limits. Ballot initiatives and open primaries have fallen to about 50% simple majority, maybe a little bit below, somewhere there, where voters are more likely. It's across the board. Independents, especially, because that makes sense, they would be more likely to support these, but you do have support from Republicans and Democrats. And so, you know, you go back and you were talking about New York being one of 9 states left in the union who don't have some form of an open primary. What's the reasoning behind these 9 states that hold on? Like, if we were to convene party leaders on both sides at the New York level, what would they say is essential and democratic about keeping a closed system?
All right, those are 2 different words, essential and democratic. Okay,
Yeah.
Let's look at the essential part in quotes. New York, one of the oldest states, one of the originals, is also traditionally a highly competitive state in statewide elections. Now, we're clearly in a democratic boom. All of our 4 statewide elected officials are Democrats. Majorities of both houses in the legislature are Democrats. Not that long ago, during the Pataki years, it was the other way around. And so it's gone back and forth. Nelson Rockefeller, liberal Republican, but the Republican Party, was dominant. So the parties are highly competitive. The parties have been traditionally highly disciplined. And let me put this in blunt terms that clearly is nonpartisan. Albany's a cesspool. Once you get there, you need the jaws of life to get people the hell out of there. And so parties make their own rules, and one of the rules is, look, no wild cards. Whoever is at the top of the mountain stays in the top of the mountain until they're knocked off the mountain. And so that means no room for independence with a small I or capital I. The problem is that the fastest growing element among registered voters in New York, as with pretty much everywhere else, is independent. Yeah, with a small I, not the Independence Party, which doesn't exist anymore. So basically, how do you deal with this new element? And this is, I think, the moment of truth.
Yeah.
The party leaders will say one thing, and voters are saying, yeah, come on. I don't want to give, I'm not talking me, but new independents are saying, I don't want to devote my entire life to being a Democrat or a Republican.
Yeah.
But I want to be able to choose who the nominee is.
Yeah. So our polls are showing that there is hunger for these issues, open primaries, term limits, and holding ballot initiatives. And this is where polling is really interesting, because had we not been commissioned to do this poll to test where voters are in terms of election and political reform, there would really be no mention of it.
No.
And so now the people have spoken, and they've shared their opinions, and now it's festering in the news, and it's going to be interesting to see whether candidates see an opportunity. I think we know Andrew Giuliani is listening to at least our poll, because shortly after the release, he went on TV. I don't know which program it was, but he said that there were hundreds of thousands of voters who don't have a chance to vote in a primary. And so it sounds like he's listening, and that's just a fascinating thing about poll, is that when candidates and leaders don't bring up the conversation, polls can bring it to the forefront.
Yeah, they can. You raised a new point. First of all, let's ask people to check out Unite New York and their agenda. But getting back to the poll, you mentioned Andrew Giuliani, and that was kind of interesting. Last week, the New York State Republican Party had its convention. Overwhelmingly, the Republican delegates designated Lee Zeldin, congressman from Long Island. 85% voted for him to be the designated candidate for governor. And yet our poll, which was done entirely after the convention, had a different leader. In fact, Andrew Giuliani had actually gained several points and was now leading Lee Zeldin by 8 points among rank and file Republican primary voters. That's fascinating. That suggests that the Republican Party MAGA element is fairly strong still in New York State.
Yeah, I guess my question would be two things. So Hochul's in the lead, and we talked about that last week. What, from between now and Election Day, what do you expect her to make front and center her campaign? Why she should lead and what she's going to do with New York? And contrast that with the current leader of Giuliani. Will he take up populism, and will he hammer these reforms as the major element of populism, or will he focus on crime and public safety? What are your immediate reactions? You've been tracking New York for decades.
Long time. For the first time since 1994, crime and public safety is the number one issue in New York. The statistics speak for themselves. You've had a tremendous spike in crimes in general, violent crimes more specifically. So both candidates have to address that. I think you're going to have two different approaches. You're going to have Kathy Hochul, who is from Buffalo, which has seen its spike in crime, but you're going to see her closer and closer to the newly elected Eric Adams in New York, who himself, is a former police official. You're going to see those two. She needs the votes in New York City, but she needs to address crime as the governor of the state. You're going to see her totally distancing herself from that incredibly stupid slogan, defund the police. You're going to be seeing funding the police very strongly, plus reforms that involve more money being spent on mental health and crime aspects. I think you're going to see Andrew Giuliani talking crime, but talking crime as a populist. And I think in many ways, I don't mean to sound partisan here, but I think he's going to be shadow boxing on the issue, just throwing whatever he can. Remember, one of the claims, the claim to fame actually that he does have, he's the son of, historically in recent years, the number one crime fighter in New York history, Rudy Giuliani. Beat the mob, you know. And so I think that is going to be front and center. There are other issues, to be sure, but that is the number one.
That was by far the number one. And I'm young enough to remember going to New York City in the 80s, and New York City in the 80s and in the 90s, two different New Yorks. Right?
Two different New Yorks.
So one could say that the playbook has already been written as to how to address that problem. So Andrew Giuliani has the blueprint.
He does, and I think we have a very interesting GOP primary coming up, because what we haven't mentioned is that a previous candidate for governor, Rob Astorino, on the Republican side, who got 40% of the vote against Andrew Giuliani, historically, is in a decent third place. In fact, you could say that the three GOP candidates, Giuliani, Zeldin, and Astorino, are in a neck-and-neck horse race.
Oh, yeah. That's a three-way.
At this point.
And from what we already saw last time. So in January, when we did the first poll, Zeldin and Giuliani were within the margin of error. I mean, they were basically virtually tied, and Astorino was all the way down at 13%. Now they're within 10 points of each other. So anything can happen.
Anything can happen. All right. The last item about polls, again, is our poll. This was a national poll conducted among parents. Tell me about it. Parents of children.
Yeah, parents of children under 12. And the major highlight, of course, was the question you came up with. And that was at the state government level. Do you think that there's too much control, too little control, or just enough in what your child learns? I think I captured the question correctly.
Do you think that feel that the state government has too much control or over what's being taught in schools?
And so there wasn't a majority, but there was a plurality. And among these parents of young children, again nationwide, 48% thought state governments have too much control. and that's fascinating coming out of Virginia and New Jersey a few months ago, that direction, that trend has really established itself nationally, and that's why they say Virginia's a bellwether. So 48% of parents with young children thought there was too much control that the government has over what their children learn in school. I believe 23% said that there was too little, and 17% said there was just enough. So almost 2 to 1, too much control to too little control. And that's a hot issue.
It's a very hot issue. It may be among, it probably is the hottest issue. It's a wedge issue, but let's parse it a little bit. First of all, what it does show is the underlying lack of trust that people have in government at all levels, in every institution. But that's where the kind of consensus ends. You have liberals and conservatives, independents and moderates, everybody across the board, with the exception of blacks, saying that the government has too much control over what kids are taught. But it's the what kids are taught is where the disagreements are, because many, on one hand, are going to say on the matter of critical race theory or social esteem, personal esteem, that the government has too much say. That's what parents should be doing. On the other hand, you're going to have others who are saying we need much more parental control. And yet, is education not the last bastion of elitism? I mean, you were in education, I was in education, for a number of years. Don't you go in with the notion that teachers know what they're doing, schools know what they're doing? I want my kid to come out prepared for the world of work, prepared for college, prepared for life. I got to trust somebody else for 7 or 8 hours a day. That's a dilemma, I think.
Yeah. And meanwhile, another question asked whether parents thought that they had their voice was heard, that their input was welcome, or that it wasn't. And I think the 34% was the plurality said that they felt it wasn't welcome, to 30 or 31% who thought that their input was. The takeaway from all of this. So let me talk about another question. Was you talked about critical race theory. We're talking about education. Another element in all of this was in school were mask mandates. And so we drilled down to the local level, the school district, and presented the question as, who has the final say? Should it be up to the parent or guardian, or should it be up to the school district to determine whether your child wears a mask at school? And wildly, almost 60% said it's up to the parent. So that one. But what's the takeaway from all of this? Parents are a highly intense group. Intense in the sense of they can be mobilized. Parents can be mobilized in elections locally, at the state level, and national. And so that's a group to really unify. And I know you can slice parents into many different categories and micro trends and all that stuff, but what's the candidate that could walk away with 60 or 55% of parents on their side? I think that's the takeaway is that they're a powerful, potentially a powerful voting bloc.
So what happened in New Jersey and in Virginia is very, very much alive today. It's one of the hottest issues: parental input, parental control in education decision making. All of the branches off of that in terms of what kind of content matters. And we get to see this play out not only in polls but in local school board elections, in local issues like book banning and so on. So something that we're clearly going to be watching.
Yeah.
I think we've done it all for a good short podcast. Anything to add?
I would tell people to check out unitenewyork.org. And then also, the Washington Examiner picked up some of these questions
Yes.
on parents. Take a look at Paul Bedard's column from yesterday, and we'll see you next week.